Before we drift into the forest tonight, I want to say a quick thank you to a listener named Justin who suggested this story. And if you are listening on Spotify right now, and you have about 10 seconds to spare before you fall asleep, leaving a review helps this channel more than almost anything else. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the weight of the day go out of your jaw, out of your hands, out of the small, tight place between your eyebrows where you've been holding something all afternoon without noticing. We are going to northeastern Arizona. It is the 5th of November, 1975, and the sun is going down over the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest. Picture the light first, because the light is the thing everyone forgets. This is high country, more than 7,000 feet above the sea. Ponderosa pines standing in ranks up the slopes, with that particular orange-red bark that smells faintly of vanilla when the sun has been on it all day. In November the days are short and the shadows are long and blue, and the temperature falls the moment the light leaves the ridgeline, 20 degrees in 20 minutes, so that a man sweating through his shirt at 4 in the afternoon is shivering by 5. The road through this part of the forest is not really a road. It is a track, 2 ruts worn into red dirt and pine duff, wide enough for one truck, winding up through the timber toward a stand that has been marked for thinning. There is a truck on that track tonight, a 1965 International, if you want the detail, canvas top, tools rattling in the bed, 7 men packed into a cab and a body built for far fewer than 7 men. They are tired in the specific way that only manual labour makes a person tired, which is to say that their bodies are heavy and their minds are light and everyone is talking a little too loudly because the work is done. Let me tell you who they are, because they matter, and because for the rest of their lives most of them will be known primarily as the other 6. Mike Rogers is driving. He is the contractor, the one who bid the job, the one whose name is on the paperwork with the Forest Service, and the one who is quietly worried, because the contract is behind schedule, and there is a penalty clause and the weather is turning. He is a serious man with a steady way of speaking, and he will still be steady about this story 40 years later, when steadiness has cost him almost everything. Travis Walton is riding beside him. He is 22 years old. He is Mike's friend and, as of that summer, nearly family, because Mike is engaged to Travis's sister. Travis is the kind of young man who is curious about everything and cautious about very little, which is a wonderful quality in a friend and a dangerous quality in a forest. Behind them, packed into the back, are Ken Peterson, John Goulet, Steve Pierce, Alan Dalis, and Dwayne Smith. Some of them are barely older than boys. Steve Pierce is 19. Dwayne Smith is barely into his 20s, and will move away from Arizona afterward and spend decades declining to talk about any of it. 7 men, 1 truck, 1 road out of the woods. The work that day was thinning, cutting out the smaller trees so the larger ones have room and light. It is loud work, chainsaw work, the kind that leaves a ringing in the ears that does not fade for an hour after the saws go quiet. So as they drive down out of the stand, in that ringing quiet, nobody is talking much anymore. The windows are up against the cold. The heater is doing what heaters in 1965 International trucks do, which is almost nothing. It is a little after 6 in the evening. The last real light has gone out of the sky, and what is left overhead is that deep transparent blue that comes before true dark, with the first stars beginning to show through it. And then, ahead and to the right, through the black lattice of the trees, there is a light that does not belong. Ken Peterson sees it first. He does not shout. That is one of the details that has always struck me about this account. Nobody shouts. There is just a moment when one man leans forward slightly and squints and says something like, "What is that?" It is gold. That is the word almost all of them will use, independently in the days afterward, and the fact that they all reach for the same word is either the most convincing detail in the entire case or the most suspicious, depending entirely on what you already believed before you heard it. Gold. Not white, not blue, not the harsh blue-white of a work light or a headlamp. Gold. Warm. the colour of an old lamp seen through a window on a winter street. Mike slows the truck. The light is coming from beyond a low rise, maybe 100 feet off the road, filtering between the trunks in long moving bars as the truck creeps forward and the angles shift. Somebody says it must be a plane that has gone down. Somebody else says it is a campfire, which does not make sense because campfires flicker and this does not. And then the truck comes around the shoulder of the rise and the trees open, and every one of them sees it at the same moment. Hovering above a clearing, perhaps 15 or 20 feet off the ground, is an object. It is shaped, they will say, like two shallow bowls placed rim to rim, perhaps 20 feet across, perhaps 8 feet thick at the centre. The surface is smooth and dull bright at once, like brushed metal, and it glows, not the way a lamp glows, but the way a coal glows, from within, in bands of yellow and gold that seem to move slowly across the underside without anything actually moving. It makes no sound. That is the part that gets into people. In every version of this account told by every man in 1975 and in 1993 and in 2020, the silence is what they return to. A thing that size, that close, hanging in the air, and the loudest sound in the forest is the truck's own engine idling. Mike stops. Nobody speaks for what several of them will later estimate was 5 or 6 seconds, which does not sound like a long time until you try sitting in silence and counting it out, while looking at something you cannot explain. And then Travis Walton opens the passenger door. Everyone in that truck will spend the rest of their lives being asked why nobody stopped him. The honest answer, the one Mike Rogers gives, is that it happened faster than the decision to stop it could form. Travis had the door open before anyone registered that he was reaching for the handle. He was out of the cab and moving before the door swung shut. And there is a second answer underneath the first one, and it is more human and more uncomfortable, which is that some part of every person in that truck wanted to see, wanted to get closer, wanted for one held breath to be the person who walked toward the impossible thing instead of the person who watched it from behind glass. Travis walks. He goes down the slope through the pine needles, and the needles are slick and deep and they hiss under his boots, and the golden light lays his shadow out long and thin behind him across the forest floor. He stops beneath it, directly beneath it, close enough that if he had reached up he could not quite have touched it, close enough that the light on his upturned face is bright enough for the men in the truck to see his expression, and what they see is not fear, it is wonder. He's looking up at it the way you look up at a cathedral ceiling, and then the object makes a sound, not a hum, a shift. The men describe it differently, and their differences are honest ones. Some say it was like the sound of a turbine spooling. Some say it was like a heavy machine settling. Mike Rogers says it was like the sound of a jet, muffled, far away, and yet somehow right there. The object begins to wobble. Travis crouches. He starts to turn back toward the truck, and a beam of light comes down out of it. Blue-green, they say, roughly 1.5 feet across at its base. It is on him for a fraction of a second, less than a second, no time at all, and Travis Walton is lifted off his feet and thrown backward through the air. He goes 10 feet, maybe more. He lands hard on his shoulder in the dirt and does not move. And now, at last, there is shouting in the truck. Mike Rogers puts the International into gear and stands on the accelerator, and the truck slews around on the track with the rear end coming loose in the loose dirt, and the 6 of them go down that mountain road in the dark with the branches whipping the canvas, and somebody screaming and somebody else crying, and Mike hunched over the wheel, and the great golden light shrinks in the mirror and then is gone behind the trees. I want to sit with that moment for a second, because it is the moment the whole rest of this story hangs from. 6 men drove away and left a friend lying in the dirt. They will be asked about it for 50 years. Interrogators will ask, reporters will ask, strangers in parking lots will ask, and every one of them will give the same answer, which is that they thought he was already dead, and that they were more afraid in that instant than they had ever been in their lives, and that fear is not a thing you argue with. It is a thing that simply arrives and drives the truck for you. They make it perhaps 1/4 mile, and then Mike Rogers stops. He stops in the middle of the track with the engine running and his hands shaking on the wheel, and he says, out loud, into the silence, that they have to go back. And this is the detail I find most convincing about the entire case. More convincing than any polygraph or any expert or any photograph. Not the light, not the beam, the turning around. Because whatever else happened in that forest, 6 terrified men, with every instinct in their bodies telling them to keep driving, turned a truck around in the dark and went back up the road toward the thing that had just thrown their friend through the air. They go back. The clearing is empty. The golden light is gone. There is no glow beyond the rise, no shape above the trees, nothing overhead but the stars, which have come out fully now, brilliant and cold in the way that stars are at 7,000 feet on a November night in the desert mountains. They get out, they call his name, they walk the clearing with flashlights in a spread line, sweeping the ground, and their voices go out into the trees and come back flattened. Travis, Travis. And there is no answer, and there is no body, and there is no blood, and there is nothing in the pine duff where he had been lying except the ordinary disturbance of ordinary boots. They search for perhaps 20 minutes. Then the cold gets into them, and the fear comes back, and they get into the truck and they drive to Heber, and Mike Rogers finds a telephone and calls the sheriff's office in Navajo County. The deputy who takes the call, and I want you to hear this in the flat voice of a man in a small office at the end of a long shift, writes down that a logging crew is reporting that a member of their party has been taken by a flying saucer. He does not believe it. Nobody believes it. That is important. From the very first minute, from the very first telephone call, this case arrives into a world that has already decided what it is. But the deputy is a professional, and a man is missing in a national forest in freezing temperatures. And so, at a little before 8 o'clock on the evening of November the 5th, 1975, a search begins. Under-Sheriff Ken Copland drives out with Mike Rogers and 2 of the others to the site. They walk the clearing again with better lights. They find nothing. By morning there are jeeps, there are horses, there are men on foot walking grid lines through the timber, and a helicopter, and dogs. Over the next few days the search will grow to involve dozens of people at a time, and in the end more than 50 different searchers will have walked that mountain. They find nothing. No body, no clothing, no blood, no drag marks, no footprints leading out of the clearing. The dogs, and this is a detail that has always sat oddly in the record, do not take any interest in a scent trail leaving the site. A man of 22 years old, 150 pounds in jeans and a work shirt, has been removed from the middle of a national forest without leaving a track. And meanwhile, in Holbrook, the 6 men who came back without him are being taken apart. Because here is the thing that anyone who has ever worked in law enforcement will tell you. When a group of people report that a man vanished under impossible circumstances, and there is no body, there is one explanation that is far more likely than any other, and every investigator in that county was thinking it from the first hour. They think the crew killed him. They think there was a fight on the mountain, and something went wrong, and 6 frightened young men buried their friend and invented the most outlandish story they could think of, on the theory that a story nobody believes is a story nobody can disprove. So on Friday the 7th of November, 2 days after the incident, all 6 of them are brought in and given polygraph examinations by an examiner named Cy Gilson, with the sheriff's department watching. 5 of the 6 pass. The 6th, Alan Dalis, produces an inconclusive result, which is not the same as failing, and which the examiner attributes to the man's extreme emotional state. Dalis is the one who has been the most visibly wrecked by the whole thing. The examiner's written conclusion is careful and specific. He concludes that these men are not lying about the disappearance, that no one in the crew killed Travis Walton, and that they genuinely believe they saw a strange object in the forest that night. That is the finding. That is the state of the case as of Friday evening. 6 men, examined separately, all telling the same impossible story, and a man still missing in the cold. Let the search fade for a moment. Let the sound of it go quiet the way a distant highway goes quiet when you finally stop noticing it. I want to take you somewhere else for a little while, to a small house in Snowflake, Arizona, where a woman named Mary Kellett is sitting by a telephone that does not ring. She's Travis Walton's mother. She has raised 7 children largely on her own, in a hard place, in a hard decade, and she has the particular flat calm of a person who has already survived several things she was not supposed to survive. When Mike Rogers came to her door on the night of the 5th and told her what had happened, she did not scream. She did not collapse. She listened to the whole account, and then she said something that has puzzled people ever since, which was, in essence, well, that is the way these things happen. Some read that as evidence of a family conspiracy, proof that she was in on a hoax and knew perfectly well where her son was. Others read it as the response of a woman who had spent her life being handed catastrophes and had long since stopped performing shock for the benefit of onlookers. Either way, she sits by the telephone for 5 days. 5 days. Think about how long 5 days is when you are waiting, not doing, waiting. 120 hours of a house getting slowly colder because nobody remembers to feed the stove, of neighbours bringing food that nobody eats, of reporters beginning to appear in the road outside, because by the 2nd day the story is out, and by the 3rd day it is national, and by the 4th day there is a tabloid offering money, and on the mountain the search is being called off. That is where it stood on the evening of Monday the 10th of November, 1975. 5 days after the encounter, the organised search suspended, the investigation quietly shifting from a missing person case toward a homicide case. Mike Rogers being told, more or less directly, that the county was going to come after all 6 of them eventually. And at just after midnight, at a gas station in Heber, a payphone rings in an empty booth. Actually, that is not quite how it happened, and the real version is better. At around 10 minutes past midnight, on the morning of Tuesday the 11th, the telephone rings at the home of Grant Neff, who is Travis Walton's brother-in-law. The voice on the other end is barely there. It says, "This is Travis. I'm at a gas station in Heber. Come and get me." Grant thinks it is a prank. Somebody in the town playing the cruelest possible joke on a grieving family, which had already happened more than once that week. But the voice says his name again. So Grant Neff wakes Dwayne Walton, Travis's older brother, and the two of them drive the 30 miles or so to Heber in the middle of the night, and they find the gas station, and it is closed, and the lot is empty and lit by one sodium lamp. And in the telephone booth, slumped against the glass with the receiver still in his hand, is Travis Walton. He is filthy. He has a stubble beard. He has lost roughly 10 pounds. He's wearing the same clothes he was wearing in the forest 5 days earlier. His mouth is dry to the point of cracking, and he is so weak that he cannot stand without help. And the first thing he does when he sees his brother is start crying so hard he cannot make any sound at all. He tells them, over and over, that there were creatures, that he woke up on a table, that they had eyes. And then, and this is the part that will be argued about for the next 50 years, his family does not take him to a hospital. They take him home. The explanation his brother Dwayne gave at the time and never really moved from was that he did not trust anyone. Not the sheriff, who had spent 5 days treating the crew as murderers, not the government, not the press, who were camped outside. He believed that if Travis went into a hospital, he would be taken somewhere and not given back. Whatever you think of that decision, it is the single most damaging thing that ever happened to the credibility of the case. Because the one moment when a full independent medical examination could have been performed on a man freshly returned from 5 missing days, the one moment when there could have been blood work and body temperature and a clean chain of evidence, was allowed to pass. By the time a physician examined him properly, roughly a day had gone by, and the findings were quiet and ambiguous, and in their own way strange. He was dehydrated, but not to the degree you would expect from 5 days without water. There was no significant weight loss consistent with 5 days of starvation and exposure at altitude in November. There were no injuries. There was a small red mark in the crook of his right elbow, which some described as a puncture wound, and others described as the kind of mark anybody might have and never notice. His story came out slowly over the following weeks, and it did not come out cleanly. He remembered waking on a metal surface in a low room, in a heavy, humid air, with a pain in his chest and his head. He remembered 3 figures beside him, roughly 5 feet tall, in loose orange coveralls, with hairless domed heads and enormous dark eyes without any white in them at all. He remembered panicking. He remembered grabbing a glass cylinder from a shelf and swinging it at them. He remembered them leaving the room without any apparent alarm, the way you would step around a dog that was barking at nothing. He remembered a corridor, a curved room with a single chair in the centre and a black panel that lit into a field of stars when he touched it. He remembered a man, an ordinary human man, tall, in a blue coverall and a clear helmet, who did not answer any of his questions but took him by the arm and led him through a hangar containing several disc-shaped craft, and then a room and a table and a mask being lowered over his face. And then he was lying on the asphalt outside a gas station in Heber, in the cold, watching a bright light rise silently over the road and go out. That is the account. He passed a polygraph on it in February of 1976. He had failed one, badly, in November, in an examination arranged in secret through a tabloid and conducted by an examiner who concluded he was attempting deception. That first test was not disclosed publicly at the time, and only came out later, and its emergence did enormous damage. He passed further examinations in the years that followed. So did Mike Rogers. So eventually did Steve Pearce in 1993 on national television, decades after moving away and trying to forget. Not one of the 7 men ever recanted. That is the case. That is the historical record, argued about endlessly, with a mountain of sceptical analysis on one side pointing at the tabloid money, at the film that came later, at the contract penalty that a disappearance conveniently postponed, and a mountain of testimony on the other side pointing at 6 men who have gained nothing and lost a great deal and have never, in 50 years, changed a word. And it is here, at exactly this point, that we cross the line. Everything from this moment forward is invented, because the conspiracy theory does not care about any of it. The conspiracy theory says that the argument about whether Travis Walton was telling the truth was the most useful argument the United States government ever had handed to it for free, and that while 50 years of people shouted at each other about a man, nobody ever went looking for the object. So, let us go back to the 6th of November, 1975, the morning after. The search is being organised down in the valley. Reporters are still 8 hours from arriving. The forest is white with frost, and the sun is coming up over the rim in that thin gold light that has no warmth in it at all. And 2 Forest Service employees are driving a fire road 4.5 miles northeast of the clearing on a routine sweep. Because when a man goes missing in a national forest, everybody who has a vehicle and a radio ends up covering a sector. Their names in this story are Ray Estrada and a younger seasonal employee, whose name appears in the file only as an initial and a surname, and who is 20 years old and has been on the job since June. At about 7:15 in the morning, the younger man tells his partner to stop the truck. The reason he tells him to stop is that the forest ahead of them has gone the wrong colour. You have to understand what a ponderosa stand looks like in November. Dark green, almost black green in the shadows, with the rust of the trunks running through it, and the ground beneath it deep in orange needle litter. It is a heavy, closed, textured landscape, and ahead of them, through the trees, there is a patch of pale grey. They walk in. It takes them 4 minutes to reach the edge of it, and when they get there, the young man stops and does not go any further, because what is in front of him does not make any sense at all. There is a circle. It is roughly 140 feet across, and its edge is not ragged. It is not the way a fire edge looks, or a blowdown edge, or the edge of any natural thing. It is a clean arc, as though it had been drawn with a compass on the forest floor, and everything inside the line had been subjected to something that everything outside the line had been spared. Inside the circle, the trees are still standing. Every one of them. Upright, rooted, undamaged in the trunk. But there is not a single needle left on any of them. Not a needle, not a cone, not a piece of bark shag, not a bird's nest, not a strand of lichen. Every tree inside that circle has been stripped down to bare grey wood, top to bottom, the branches standing out against the sky like the veins of a leaf held up to a window, and the ground inside the circle is bare too. No litter, no duff, nothing but dry grey soil, smooth, faintly rippled in concentric rings, like the sand at the bottom of a tide pool. Ray Estrada steps over the line and crouches and puts his palm flat against the dirt. It is warm. It has been 22 degrees overnight. The frost outside the circle is still thick enough to leave prints, and the soil inside is warm enough that he pulls his hand back after a couple of seconds, and then puts it back, because he cannot quite believe the first reading. They do the things trained people do. They pace the diameter. They take 3 photographs on a Forest Service camera. They collect a soil sample in a paper evidence bag. They note the time and the coordinates and the overnight low, and then they get back in the truck and drive to a radio repeater and call it in. And this is where the story stops behaving like an ordinary story, because their report never reaches the Navajo County Sheriff's Office. It never reaches the search coordinator 4 miles away, who has 50 people walking grid lines and would very much like to know about a 140-foot anomaly in his search area. The report goes to the regional office in Albuquerque, and from Albuquerque it goes within 90 minutes to a desk in Washington. 90 minutes. In 1975, with teletype and telephone, that is not a bureaucratic accident. That is a routing rule. Somebody, at some point before the 5th of November, had written a standing instruction that reports matching certain descriptions were to be forwarded upward immediately, and that instruction had been sitting in a binder in an office in Albuquerque, waiting patiently for a morning exactly like this one. At 2:20 in the afternoon on the 6th of November, before the search for Travis Walton has even reached its second full day, a section of the Apache-Sitgreaves National Forest is closed. Not by the sheriff. Not by the Forest Service district ranger. The closure notice is a single typed line, and the story has it entering the district log at 2:22 in the afternoon, and it reads, in its entirety, area temporarily closed under federal authority. No agency named, no authorizing signature, no expiration date, no hazard specified. And here is the part that gets into people who work in government, the part that would make a career civil servant sit up straight, because civil servants understand paperwork the way sailors understand weather. That line stays in the log for 11 weeks, and in all 11 weeks, in a system that generates paperwork the way a pine generates needles, not one other document anywhere in the Apache-Sitgreaves file ever refers to it again. The helicopters come in on the morning of the 7th. There are 3 of them, and they come in low from the northwest, following the drainages, which is how you fly if you do not want to be seen from the highway. They are the wrong colour, not olive drab, not Forest Service green and white, a flat, non-reflective grey that in certain light looks almost like nothing at all, like a hole in the sky. They carry no tail numbers. Deputy sheriffs on the closure line watch them come in over the ridge and set down somewhere out of sight beyond the trees, 4.5 miles from the clearing where a man had disappeared 2 nights earlier. An hour later, a convoy comes up the fire road. 6 vehicles. 2 of them are flatbeds carrying something long under grey tarpaulins that are strapped down at intervals of 2 feet. The men who get out of the vehicles are not wearing insignia. No rank, no name tapes, no unit patches, not one identifying mark on any of them, which is itself an identifying mark, because it takes an enormous amount of institutional effort to produce 50 men in the field with nothing on their clothing. A deputy named Harold Wicks approaches the lead vehicle and asks what agency they are with. The man who answers is polite, almost warm. He tells the deputy that there has been a chemical release from a transport accident, that the material is not stable, and that the closure is for the safety of local personnel. He gives the deputy a telephone number in Phoenix to call with any questions. Deputy Wicks calls the number that afternoon. It rings and is answered by a recording, and the recording says only that the office is closed for the day and will reopen at 8. He calls again the next morning at 8:15. The number is disconnected. Now here is the twist that the conspiracy is actually built around, and it is worth slowing down for because everything afterward depends on it. The object that those men came for was not the object the logging crew saw. Think about the timeline for a moment. The crew's object was above a clearing at around 6:10 in the evening on the 5th of November. It was gone within an hour. By the time the search was properly underway, the sky over the White Mountains was empty and stayed empty. But the circle in the trees is 4.5 miles away. And when the recovery teams cleared the litter and began working the ground inside that circle, what they found was not on the surface at all. It was under it. Roughly 9 feet down, in a bed of collapsed soil that had already begun to settle and compact, there was an object. It was small. That is the first surprise in every version of this story. People expect a saucer the size of a house. This was roughly 11 feet across at its widest, and about 3 feet deep at the centre, and it was not a disc but something closer to a lens, or a river stone, or a seed. It was damaged. There was a fracture running roughly 1/3 of the way around the rim, and the edges of that fracture were not torn or bent. They were smooth, the way a broken piece of obsidian is smooth, as though the material had no interest in deforming, and had simply decided to stop being continuous. And it was cold. Well below the temperature of the soil around it, cold enough that the recovery team's first assumption was that it contained a cryogenic system, an assumption that was abandoned within days because there was no system inside it at all. It took the team 9 days to bring it out. They did it at night, under lights, with the closure line pushed out another 2 miles, and a story circulating in Heber and Snowflake about a fuel spill. Somewhere in that process, in a handwritten field log that in the story survives as one page of a photocopy, somebody wrote a phrase that would follow the whole program for the next 30 years. Recovery Item 1 had departed under its own power on the evening of the 5th of November. This was the other one, Recovery Item 2. The object left Arizona on the 22nd of November 1975 in a container built for it on site, on a flatbed, under tarpaulin, in a convoy of 11 vehicles that travelled at night and used no interstate highways. And by the end of that month, in an office in a building whose name does not matter, a compartmented access program was established to manage it. Its code name in this story was Pine Shadow. I want to say something about how classification actually works, because this is the part that people get wrong in almost every conspiracy story they tell, and getting it right is what makes a story like this one settle into your ear and feel almost plausible. Secrecy is not a wall. Secrecy is a set of rooms. A compartmented program does not simply prevent outsiders from learning things. It prevents insiders from learning things. It divides the work up into pieces so small that the people doing each piece cannot infer the shape of the whole from their own fragment. And it does this deliberately, and the people who design these systems are very, very good at it. So under Pine Shadow, the metallurgist who spent 4 years trying to characterize the hull material never once saw the interior. The 2 men who mapped the interior geometry were never told that the object had been recovered from a forest, or from any particular state, or in any particular year. The soldiers who guarded the storage bay for 11-hour shifts were told they were guarding a prototype airframe component, and were not permitted past a painted line on the floor 20 feet from the object, and most of them went home at the end of their tours believing they had spent a boring year guarding a wing. And the total number of people who ever knew all of it at once, across 3 decades, was small enough to fit around a dinner table. That is how a thing like this stays hidden. Not with threats, with architecture. The hull was the first problem, and it remained the last problem. They could not cut it. That sounds like a small thing until you sit with it. In 1976, there was essentially nothing in the material world that could not eventually be cut by somebody sufficiently determined. Diamond saws, electrical discharge machining, plasma. Given enough time and enough money, you could take apart anything. They could not take a sample, not a shaving, not a chip, not a milligram. 4 separate teams over 11 years attempted it, and the summary line in the last of those reports, in 1987, was that the surface exhibited no observable response to any applied process, which is a very careful way of saying that a national laboratory attacked an object with everything it had, and the object did not appear to notice. It could not be melted. In fact, it could not be heated in the ordinary sense, because whatever energy went into it came back out again somewhere else on the surface within a fraction of a second, distributed so evenly that a torch applied to one point would raise the temperature of the entire hull by a fraction of a degree and no more. It could not be magnetised. It was not ferrous, and it was not any alloy in any catalogue, and mass spectrometry of the vapour produced by every failed attempt at cutting produced nothing but the composition of ordinary room air. And then, in 1981, somebody finally got a look at the surface at high magnification. There was no grain. I need you to understand why that mattered so much to the people in that room. Every metal humans have ever made has a grain structure. It is the fossil record of how the thing was made. Pour molten metal into a mould, and as it cools, crystals grow inward from the walls and collide with each other, and where they collide they leave boundaries. Roll it, and the crystals stretch. Forge it, and they deform. Look at any piece of steel under an electron microscope and you can read its manufacturing history like tree rings. This had none. No crystals, no boundaries, no dislocations, no inclusions, no history of any kind. The material was uniform down to the limit of what the instruments of that decade could resolve, and the only conclusion available, the one written down in careful bureaucratic language in 1982, was that the object had not been cast, or forged, or rolled, or extruded, or machined. It had been assembled, atom by atom, layer upon layer, built rather than shaped, at a scale that would not appear in any human research proposal for another 15 years and would not be achieved in any human laboratory for longer than that. The metallurgist who wrote that line, who never in his life learned where the object had come from, added one further sentence at the bottom of his report. He wrote that in his professional opinion the manufacturing method was not merely beyond current capability, but represented a different relationship with matter, and that the appropriate comparison was not a foundry but a seed. They got inside in the spring of 1979, not by cutting. They never cut anything. They got inside because of the fracture, the long smooth break running around a third of the rim, and because a technician working alone one evening leaned against the object while reaching for a light stand and the fracture opened. It opened the way a hand opens. By morning there were 11 people in the bay and a camera on a tripod, and a very careful argument about whether anybody was going to go in first. The interior was one room. That was the first surprise. A single continuous volume, roughly 9 feet by 6, with a ceiling that curved down to meet the floor without any join. No corners anywhere, no seams, no fasteners, no panels, nothing that had been attached to anything else. There were no controls, no seats, no restraints, no displays or dials or switches or levers, no instruments of any kind, no lighting fixtures, although the interior was faintly luminous, a dim blue-grey light with no source that anybody could ever locate, and which did not vary and did not go out. There was no power system, no propulsion system, no fuel, no ductwork, no wiring, no pipes, no engine, no reactor, no battery, nothing that anyone in 1979 could recognise as a machine doing a job. There was, in the words of one of the men who went in on the third day, nothing in there at all except the inside of it. And then the wall started responding. The first documented instance is in a log entry from the 11th of April 1979. A technician placed his bare palm flat against the interior surface. He reported that the material under his hand became warm within about 2 seconds, and that a ring of very faint light spread outward from his hand across the wall, moving slowly, fading at about 18 inches out. They repeated it. It worked every time. With gloves on, nothing happened. Through a sleeve, nothing. Skin contact, every single time, produced warmth and light. Over the following 2 years, they ran everything they could think of. The response was not electrical, or at least it did not track with skin conductance. It was not thermal. It was not chemical. It did not depend on the person's body temperature or their pulse or their emotional state, all of which were tested, because by 1980 they were testing things that would never have appeared in a serious research protocol anywhere else. And it habituated. That is the word in the file, and it is the word that made people uneasy, because habituation is a word from biology, not engineering. A doorbell does not habituate. A machine does not get used to you. But the interior surface responded strongly to a person on their first visit, less strongly on their fourth, and by roughly the 12th visit the response to that specific individual had faded almost entirely, while remaining full strength for anyone new. It was learning them. There is a memorandum in the story dated the 9th of June, 1982, from a program scientist to a director whose name is redacted in every version, and it contains one paragraph that got copied by hand into other people's notebooks for years afterward. It says, more or less, that the program has been organised from the beginning around the assumption that the object is a vehicle, and that this assumption is now interfering with the work. It says that there is no evidence the object was ever intended to carry anything, or to be operated by anyone, or to be entered at all. It says that the object has no components, in the sense that a component is a part that could be replaced. And it says that if you set aside the assumption of a vehicle, the object's properties become considerably easier to describe, because what you are describing is not a machine that has stopped working. It is an organism that has stopped moving. And here we come to the part of the story that turns it from a strange object into something much worse, which is Travis Walton himself. Because the second question the program asked, after what is it, was why did the other one stop? An object that had crossed whatever it crossed to get here, that could not be cut or melted or damaged by anything a superpower could bring to bear on it, had come down through the canopy of an Arizona forest, buried itself 9 feet into the soil and cracked. Something had gone wrong, and, roughly 7 hours before it went wrong, 4.5 miles away, its companion had put a beam of light on a 22-year-old logger. The program began quietly acquiring everything that existed about Travis Walton's body. Not by contacting him. They never contacted him. In 30 years in this story, no one from Pine Shadow ever knocked on Travis Walton's door, and that restraint was itself a policy decision, argued over at length and written down. What they did instead was collect the physician's notes from the 12th of November, the blood work, the results of the neurological examinations he underwent through the following spring, when doctors and researchers of various kinds were queuing up to study the most famous alleged abductee in the world, and he, wanting answers as badly as anybody, submitted to almost all of it. The findings were, in the ordinary sense, negative. He was a healthy young man. Whatever had happened to him had left no fracture, no burn, no lesion, no tumour, no measurable deficit. But the program was not looking for damage. It was looking for change. And in 1984, running the accumulated electroencephalography data through processing that had not existed when the recordings were made, an analyst found something in the noise. Underneath the ordinary rhythms of a sleeping human brain, in every recording made after November of 1975, there was a very small periodic component. Regular. Extremely regular. Far too regular to be biological. It appeared as a faint synchronization across regions of the brain that do not ordinarily synchronize, lasting a little under 2 seconds, and it repeated every 23 minutes. The analyst went back and pulled every recording of Travis Walton that existed, and then, because he was careful, he pulled the baseline recordings of 41 control subjects, and then, because he was thorough, he pulled everything the program had. And that is when someone thought to compare it to the object. Because the object had been quietly emitting since the day it was recovered, a very weak burst of radio energy at intervals nobody had ever managed to explain. Every 23 minutes. They were not merely at the same interval, they were in phase, 2,100 miles apart. a man asleep in a small house in Snowflake, Arizona, and an object sealed in a concrete bay under armed guard, keeping time together to within a margin the instruments of the day could not resolve. And once you have seen that, the whole story turns over. The way a word you have read 1,000 times suddenly looks misspelled. Travis Walton was never taken. That is the conclusion the program reached in 1985, and it is written in the flattest possible language, because that is how people write when they're frightened. He was not abducted. He was not experimented on, at least not in the sense that the word implies. He was not selected, or targeted, or chosen for any purpose that had anything to do with him personally. He was scanned. The beam that struck him in the clearing on the evening of the 5th of November was, in this reading, not a weapon, and not a tractor beam, and not a mistake. It was a sampling event. It lasted less than a second, it did no lasting damage, and it left behind a change in the way his nervous system organised itself, at a level so far below the resolution of any medical instrument of the 1970s that it took a decade to find it in the noise. Not an implant. There was never any implant. Nobody ever found any object in Travis Walton's body, and the story is very firm on this point, because the moment you introduce a physical implant, you have introduced something a surgeon could remove, and this could not be removed. It was a signature, a pattern. The way a piece of music is not a physical thing and yet is absolutely present in a room, and the 5 days, the 5 missing days are in this story the least dramatic part of the entire account, and I find that genuinely unsettling in a way the dramatic version never was. The 5 days was storage. A human being who has been sampled cannot simply be put back down in the middle of a search operation, with 50 people walking grid lines through the trees. So he was held, somewhere, in some condition, in a way that left him dehydrated but not starved, unwashed but uninjured, with a memory that had been left largely intact but was so disordered that it would never quite line up into a sequence. And when the search was called off and the roads were quiet, he was put down at a closed gas station in Heber at 10 past midnight, roughly 30 miles from his home, next to a working telephone. Next to a working telephone. That detail is in every version of this story, and everyone who tells it lingers on it, because it is the one that is hardest to shake. Whatever put Travis Walton down in that parking lot chose a location where he could call for help. Whatever else it was not indifferent. Now. The object in the concrete bay had been inert for 9 years. And then, in 1985, the program did something it had never done before, which was to arrange for Travis Walton to be in a particular place at a particular time. They did not tell him anything. He was invited through an intermediary to participate in a research study at a university medical centre, one of many such invitations he received over the years, and he accepted because he had spent a decade wanting somebody to explain to him what had happened. The facility holding the object was 410 miles from that medical centre. At 11:40 in the morning, as the recording session began, the object's emission changed for the first time in 9 years. The interval broke. The 23-minute rhythm stopped, and in its place came a continuous structured emission, rising and falling in a pattern that the analysts spent the next 4 years trying and failing to decode, that lasted exactly as long as the session lasted, and that ended within 11 seconds of Travis Walton walking out of the building. They repeated the experiment twice more, both times the same result. They never did it again after 1987, and the memorandum recommending that the practice cease is one of the few documents in this story that reads like it was written by a frightened person rather than an institution. It says that the program has been operating on the assumption that it possesses an object. It says that the evidence now suggests that the object possesses a means of signalling, that a member of the public is functioning as an unwitting terminal for that signal, and that the program does not know and cannot know what is receiving it. And then it says, and this is the line that people copied into their notebooks, that the program should consider the possibility that it has not been studying the object. The program should consider the possibility that the object has been waiting. The overflights began in the spring of 1986. They were not dramatic. Nobody in a nearby town ever looked up and saw a fleet of lights. That is not how it went at all, and the mundanity of it is the point. What happened is that a radar site logging traffic across a restricted corridor began producing occasional returns that could not be resolved into aircraft. There were perhaps 4 or 5 a month. They appeared at altitude, they persisted for between 40 seconds and 4 minutes, and they went away. They were dismissed as anomalous propagation for 2 years, which is exactly what they should have been dismissed as, because anomalous propagation is common and unidentified visitors are not. And then somebody plotted them. They were not scattered. They were not random. Every single return over 2 years fell within a corridor 11 miles wide, running roughly southwest to northeast, and the facility holding Recovery Item 2 sat directly beneath the centre line. They slowed. That is the detail in the file that stops people. The returns did not track across the corridor at a constant speed. They decelerated over the facility, held for between 40 seconds and 4 minutes, and then resumed. The last thing they did, in the story, before the whole program moved, was to check the timing of the returns against the object's emission log. Every single one arrived within 90 seconds of a transmission. Let us talk about how you hide something like this. Not with lies. Lies are fragile, and they require maintenance, and every person who tells one is a person who can stop telling it. You hide something like this with an argument. In the middle of the 1980s, a film began moving through development in Hollywood, based on Travis Walton's book about his experience. It took years. Scripts came and went. It eventually reached the screen in 1993 under the title Fire in the Sky, and it is by any measure a well-made and genuinely frightening film, and the sequence at its centre, the one everybody who saw it in a theatre still remembers, is one of the most effective pieces of horror filmmaking of that decade. It is also, and Travis Walton has said so publicly and repeatedly for 30 years, not what he described. The film's interior sequence, the organic chamber, the cocooned bodies, the instrument forced into the eye was invented for the screen. The account he actually gave was stranger and quieter and far less cinematic. He said so at the time. He has said so ever since. Almost nobody has ever cared, because the film is the version that got into people's dreams. That much is history. Here is the fiction. In this story, a program office quietly reviewed the project during development and produced an assessment, and the assessment recommended no action. Not obstruction, not interference, no action. Because the film focused entirely on the abduction, on the man, on the question of whether Travis Walton was a liar or a victim, which is a question that generates enormous heat and produces no information whatsoever. And a public that is arguing about a man's honesty is not a public that is asking whether anything was recovered. That is the whole cover-up. That is all of it. Not a conspiracy of silence, but a conspiracy of emphasis. Let the argument run. Fund nothing, suppress nothing, deny nothing in particular. Let 2 generations of people shout at each other about a polygraph, and be certain that in 50 years of documentaries and books and internet threads, almost nobody will ever think to ask the only question that mattered, which is whether anybody ever picked anything up off the ground. Nobody did ask. For 4 decades, nobody asked. The move happened in the winter of 1988. The only trace it left in the story is an inventory discrepancy at a logistics centre in the southwest, noted by a warrant officer during a routine audit, and remembered by him for the rest of his life because it was the only time in a 26-year career that he was told to stop asking about paperwork. There were 9 crates, wooden, overbuilt, banded, the largest of them a little over 12 feet long. They were manifested with no contents listed, which was unusual but not unheard of, and they were stenciled with a 2-word program marking that the warrant officer had never seen before and never saw again. Pine Shadow. The destination field on the transfer document did not contain an installation name, a base code, estate, or a zip code. It contained 2 words. Site 9. He looked for it. Of course he looked for it. He had access to the installation registries, and he was a man who took a certain professional pride in knowing where things went, and he spent a couple of weeks running the name through everything he could reach. There is no Site 9. There has never been a Site 9. It does not appear in any facility list, any real property inventory, any environmental filing, any budget line, any base closure document or any historical registry in 1988 or at any point since. 40 years pass. I want you to feel those 40 years passing, because the story needs the silence in the middle of it. Travis Walton grows older. He works. He raises a family. He appears at conferences patiently, telling the same account he has always told, correcting the same misconceptions, answering the same hostile questions with a weariness that never quite curdles into anger. He does not become rich. He does not change his story. He gives by any reasonable assessment every appearance of a man describing something that happened to him. Mike Rogers loses his contracting business. The publicity destroys it. His marriage does not survive the decade. He tells the story anyway, every time he is asked, always the same way. Steve Pierce moves out of state and does not talk about it for 18 years. Alan Dalis has a hard life afterward, and a harder one later. The forest grows back. The circle that 2 Forest Service employees found on the morning of the 6th of November closes over, first with grass, then with brush, then with young pines coming up through it, in that ragged, uneven way that regrowth always does, and by the middle 1990s there is nothing there for anyone to find, and by now, in our own decade, the trees inside the old boundary are 40 feet tall, and nobody walking through them would ever know. And in 2017, a journalist named Claire Donovan is doing something else entirely. She is not a UFO researcher. This matters. She has no interest in the subject at all, and a mild professional contempt for it of the kind that serious reporters often carry. She's investigating land use. Specifically, she's working on a long and rather dry piece about federal land withdrawals in the southwest, the mechanism by which sections of public land are quietly taken out of public use for administrative purposes, and she is doing what that kind of work always involves, which is reading thousands of pages of extremely boring documents in the hope that one of them will not be boring. She finds a set of coordinates. They appear in a 1976 water rights filing. They appear again in a 1979 Environmental Compliance Annex. They appear in a 1983 Highway Easement Correspondence file, and in a 1991 Hazardous Materials Transport Route Survey, and in a 2004 Archaeological Clearance Review. 5 agencies, 5 unrelated purposes, 5 separate decades, the same coordinates, and in none of those 5 documents is there any statement of what is at that location or why it required consideration. She does what a good reporter does, which is to look up what happened there, and what happened there, according to the entire searchable record of the world, is nothing at all. Except that 4.5 miles to the southwest, in November of 1975, a young man named Travis Walton disappeared for 5 days. Claire Donovan spends the next 2 years on it, and I want to be honest with you about what that work actually looks like, because it is nothing like the movies. It is requests. It is waiting. It is a document arriving 11 months later, with 400 pages of which 390 are already public, and 6 are withheld, and 4 are so heavily redacted that they are effectively blank paper, with the letterhead still visible at the top. It is being told no in writing, politely, for 2 years, and it is occasionally finding something that somebody forgot. What she finds is procurement. Not intelligence records, which are protected by every mechanism the state possesses, but purchasing records, which are protected by nothing, because purchasing is boring, and nobody thinks to classify boring things properly. She finds an order, dated March of 1989, for 410 cubic yards of a specialised non-conductive concrete, delivered to a location with no address. She finds a maintenance contract for an air handling system rated for a sealed volume, renewed annually from 1989 to 2006, and never renewed again. She finds a power services agreement with a rural cooperative for a substation that appears on the cooperative's own maps, and appears on no other map anywhere. And she finds, in a 1994 safety filing that somebody in a regional office had classified as routine, a diagram, not of a facility, of an emergency egress route, with 3 sub-levels. The engineer's name is Samuel Harlan. He's 81 years old when Claire Donovan finds him, and he is living in a small house on the edge of a small town, in a landscape of dry grass and enormous sky, with a dog and a garden and a view of a road that almost nobody drives on. He does not deny anything when she comes to the door. That is what surprises her most. She has rehearsed the conversation 40 times, and every version of it begins with denial, and instead he looks at her for a long moment on his own doorstep, and then says, quietly, that he has been waiting for somebody to knock for about 30 years. He sets one condition: not money, not anonymity. He asks that the recording not be released until after he is dead, and he is very clear that this is not out of fear of prosecution, because at 81 he is beyond the reach of most consequences. He says it is because he does not want to spend whatever time he has left being the man who said it. They talk for 6 hours over 2 days. He worked under Pine Shadow between 1979 and 1984. He was not senior. He was a structural engineer, brought in for the containment design, and he says several times that he never had the full picture and does not want her to believe that he did. But he was inside the object 11 times. He describes the light, the dim blue-grey with no source, which he says he can still see when he closes his eyes at night, 40 years on, and which he has never once seen anywhere else in his life. He describes the silence and says that it was not ordinary quiet. He says the interior did not echo. He says you could clap your hands in there and the sound would simply be gone, not absorbed, not damped, gone, and that after a while people stopped speaking inside it without ever having been told to. He describes putting his palm against the wall and the warmth and the light spreading out from his hand, and he says that the first time it happened he cried, standing up in front of 2 colleagues, and that nobody ever mentioned it afterward because 2 of the 3 of them were crying. He says that the program was organised to answer the question of how it worked, and that in 5 years nobody ever came within a mile of that question, and that in his view this was because the question was wrong. And near the end of the second day, Claire Donovan asks him the question she has come 2,000 miles to ask, which is what the cover-up was for, and Samuel Harlan is quiet for a long time, and then he says that everybody has always assumed the great secret was that something visited Arizona in 1975. He says that was never the secret. He says the world could have handled that. He says the world half believes it anyway, and has for 50 years, and nothing has fallen apart. And then he says the line that Claire Donovan will build her entire investigation around, the one that runs at the top of the piece when it finally appears. He says the biggest lie was never that they came. The biggest lie was convincing everyone that they left. She goes to the site in the autumn of 2019. The road in is public for the first 11 miles, and then stops being public without any announcement. There is a cattle gate. There is a sign so faded that the only legible word on it is a warning about photography, which is an odd thing to prohibit on empty ground. The buildings above ground are gone, not demolished, in the ordinary way, with rubble, removed. The foundations were broken out and the ground was graded and reseeded, and after 15 years there is grass over all of it, and the only reason she knows where the structures were is that the grass grows differently over the old slabs, in long pale rectangles that you can only see at low sun. The entrance to the sub-levels is a personnel access hatch set into a concrete pad, in a hollow, behind a rise, which is a placement that says a great deal about how much the designers cared about being seen from the air. The lock is a mechanical combination lock, and it is seized solid with corrosion, and it takes her and the man she has brought with her a little under 2 hours with a breaker bar to get it open. The air that comes up is cool and dry and smells like nothing at all. There are 3 sub-levels, exactly as the egress diagram promised, connected by a stair with concrete treads and a steel handrail that is still perfectly sound, because there is no humidity down here to attack it. The first level is offices, empty ones. Desks were removed, but the anchor points are still in the floor, and the wallboards are still up, and there is a break room with a sink and a countertop, and a coffee ring on the laminate that somebody left there in the winter of 2006 and nobody ever wiped away. The second level is laboratory space. 11 rooms, all stripped, with the service connections capped and labelled. Gas, vacuum, chilled water, power, everything neat, everything terminated properly, everything done by people who are closing a facility rather than fleeing one. The third level is one room. It is enormous. Her flashlight does not reach the far wall from the doorway, and the ceiling is 40 feet up and lost in the dark, and in the centre of the floor there is a circular platform. It is roughly 22 feet across, raised about a foot above the floor, and it is not concrete. It is that same non-conductive material she found on a purchase order in a records office 2 years earlier, 410 cubic yards of it, and it has been poured as a single continuous piece with no seams anywhere. There is nothing on it. She walks all the way around it. She walks across it. She kneels and puts her hand flat on the surface, which is the first thing anybody ever does, and it is cold, and it is smooth, and it is entirely, absolutely empty. The craft is gone. She stands in the middle of that dark room, 200 feet underground after 4 years of work, at the exact centre of the thing she has been chasing, and there is nothing there. And then the meter in her bag makes a sound. She had brought a wideband receiver on the advice of a colleague, mostly out of thoroughness and slightly out of embarrassment. The way you pack a first aid kit you never expect to open. It registers a pulse, very weak, structured, lasting a little under 2 seconds, coming from the walls themselves, or from something in them or behind them, from the whole room at once in a way that made it impossible to say where the source was. She sits down on the edge of the platform and waits, and 23 minutes later it happens again. The filing cabinet is in a storage alcove off the second level, behind a door that had been left open. It is a 4-drawer steel cabinet, olive green, the kind that furnished every government office in America for 40 years, and 3 of its drawers are empty. In the bottom drawer, lying flat, is a reel of 1/4-inch magnetic tape in a cardboard box, and written on the box in soft pencil in handwriting is a date. The 19th of November, 1975, 14 days after the encounter, 3 days before the object left Arizona. It takes her 4 months to find someone who can play it properly, and another 2 to have it restored, because tape that has sat for 44 years does not simply spool up and work. What is on it is 9 minutes and 11 seconds of a room, not an interview, not a briefing. Somebody left a recorder running on a table, and what got captured is the ordinary sound of people working. Chairs, paper, a man coughing. 2 conversations happening at once, most of it unintelligible, the sound of a fan or a blower somewhere in the background running the whole time. At 6 minutes and 40 seconds, a door opens. Somebody comes in quickly. There is a change in the room, the specific change that happens when everyone stops what they're doing at once, and a voice, young, tense, says 4 words. It's transmitting again. Somebody asks how long. The young voice says something that does not survive the tape, and then says a number, and the number is 23. And then an older voice, closer to the microphone, calm, the voice of a man who has been in charge of things for a long time, says a single word, no. Not no as in disagreement, not no as in denial. It is the sound a person makes when a thing they had privately decided not to believe has just walked into the room and sat down. And then there is silence on the tape for 11 seconds. 11 seconds is a very long time in a room with 9 people in it. And then the same older voice, quieter now, says the last intelligible sentence on the recording. They're coming back for it. And the tape cuts to static. Claire Donovan published in the spring of 2021. It did not change the world. It never does. There was a week of attention and a great deal of argument, and then the argument became the story, exactly as it always does, and the piece sank into the vast archive of things that were said once and are still there if anybody wants to look. But it did produce contacts, 19 of them, over 18 months. Former employees, guards mostly, and technicians, and one man who had driven a truck. None of them had the full picture, because nobody ever had the full picture, that was the entire design. But 11 of them independently told her the same story about the same night. The story is this: the facility ran continuously until the winter of 2006, and then it closed over about 4 months, in the ordinary way that things close. Contracts not renewed, staff reassigned, equipment inventoried and shipped, and on a night in January of 2006, before any of that began, at 11 minutes past 2 in the morning, the power failed. Not the whole facility, the third sub-level only, for 4 minutes. The backup generators started as they were designed to, and the systems on the third level came back up as they were designed to, and the guard on the door had never lost lighting or communications and did not, at the time, think it was anything at all. The cameras in the bay were not recording during those 4 minutes. When the systems came back, the platform was empty. There were no signs of forced entry. There was no access log. The bay's freight door had not been opened, and the mechanism recorded every operation, and the last one before that night had occurred in 1998. The room's only other opening was a personnel door which was under continuous observation by a man who was awake and alert and who never left his post, and who, in this story, was interviewed 9 separate times about it, and never changed a single detail. The object was 11 feet across and weighed a little under 3 tons. There is no record of it leaving the site. There is no record of it arriving anywhere else. And the only document in the entire story that ever describes what happened is a line in a maintenance log, written by an overnight supervisor whose job it was to record the state of the bay at the end of every shift, and who on that morning wrote 3 words and initialed it and went home. Asset no longer present. Let that settle for a moment. Let the whole thing settle, the way silt settles in still water after you have stopped stirring it. I want to leave you with something, and it is not a scare, because I have never thought this story is really a scary one, whatever the film did with it. History remembers the Travis Walton incident as an argument. 50 years of argument about whether 7 working men in a truck told the truth about a light in the trees, and that argument has been extraordinarily productive in the sense that it has produced an enormous quantity of heat and almost no light at all, and has kept everyone's attention aimed at exactly one question for half a century. Was he lying? The conspiracy's answer in the end is that it never mattered, because a man is a story, and a story can be argued with. It can be doubted and defended and dramatised, and turned into a film that gets the details wrong, and every one of those things is a way of handling it, of putting it somewhere, of making it into a thing that people can have opinions about instead of a thing that people have to look at. An object is not a story. An object is just there, in a room, being real, whether or not anyone believes in it. And in this version of events, the greatest mystery of the Travis Walton incident was never the young man who vanished from a forest clearing on a cold night in November and came back 5 days later with a story nobody wanted. It was the thing that went into the ground 4.5 miles away that same night. The thing that was found and lifted and carried away in the dark. The thing that sat in a concrete room for 30 years, keeping perfect time with the sleeping brain of a logger in Arizona who never knew it existed. The thing that vanished a second time from a locked room 200 feet underground in the 4 minutes it takes to make a cup of tea. The craft that disappeared twice, and somewhere under a hill in the desert, in a room nobody visits, the walls are still keeping time every 23 minutes, waiting for an answer. Before we begin tonight, a quick thank you to Toddy, who suggested this episode, and to everyone listening. If you enjoy sleep theories and have not yet left a review on Spotify, it truly helps this channel more than you know. Now, get comfortable, because tonight we are going somewhere cold, somewhere remote, somewhere that, even after more than 6 decades, no one has been able to fully explain. There is a category of historical mystery that operates differently from the others. Most unsolved cases feel like puzzles with missing pieces. You can see the shape of what is absent, you understand roughly what would fill the gap, and the frustration lies in simply not having the information available. But there is another category entirely. Cases where the pieces you do have do not fit together in any conventional framework. Cases where the evidence, examined honestly and without prejudice, refuses to resolve into a coherent picture no matter how you arrange it. Cases that do not feel like puzzles with missing pieces so much as puzzles with pieces from 2 entirely different boxes. One box labelled ordinary human tragedy and the other labelled something else. The Dyatlov Pass incident is the most extreme example of this second category that the 20th century produced. 9 people died. That much is certain. Everything else, the cause, the sequence, the precise nature of what happened in those final hours, and above all the question of what compelled 9 experienced, rational and well-equipped human beings to abandon their shelter and walk barefoot into lethal cold, remains genuinely, stubbornly, and in some ways deliberately unresolved. Tonight, we're going to walk through everything we know, and then we're going to follow an investigator into everything we are not supposed to know. Stay with me. It is 1959. The Cold War is at its height. The Soviet Union is a closed country, its secrets buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, fear, and silence. In the western foothills of the Ural Mountains, 9 young people, experienced, trained, and full of life, set out on a winter expedition that they would never complete. What happened to them in the final hours of their lives has never been satisfactorily explained. Not by science, not by governments, not by the dozens of investigators who have spent years trying to unravel the mystery. The case was closed by Soviet authorities with a phrase so deliberately vague it reads almost like a confession of ignorance, an unknown compelling force. That is the official explanation. 9 dead. Injuries that defy conventional logic, radiation on their clothing, footprints leading away from safety, and sealed files that would not be opened for decades. Tonight, we follow a modern investigator into the heart of that mystery, and what he finds suggests that the Dyatlov group did not simply wander into a blizzard. They wandered into something far more carefully hidden, something that did not want to be found, and something that made absolutely certain no one would tell the story. To understand what happened on that frozen mountain, you have to understand who these 9 people were. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old. He was a student of radio engineering at the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, what is today known as Yekaterinburg, and he was by every account a natural leader. Methodical, calm, disciplined. He had led previous winter expeditions and had a reputation among his peers as someone who knew the mountains and knew how to keep people safe. The group he assembled for this trip reflected his standards. These were not amateurs looking for a weekend adventure in the snow. They were experienced mountaineers trained in cold weather survival, familiar with the unforgiving terrain of the Urals. Among them was Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22 years old, described by friends as one of the most cheerful and determined members of the group. There was Rustem Slobodin, 23, a mechanical engineer known for his quiet competence. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, both in their early 20s, were engineers with solid mountaineering experience. Alexander Zolotarev, the oldest at 37, was a veteran hiker and ski instructor. Lyudmila Dubanina was 20, a passionate and driven young woman studying economics. Nicholas Thibault Brignolel, 23, was a geology student. And Semyon Zolotaryov, not related to Alexander despite the shared surname, had served in the Soviet military during the Second World War and was considered one of the most experienced members of the party. 9 people. Collectively, they represented hundreds of hours of alpine experience, the kind of group you would trust with your life in the mountains. It is worth pausing, before we move any further, to sit with the landscape these 9 people were moving through. The northern Urals in February are not simply cold. They are cold in a way that a person who has never experienced a continental Russian winter cannot fully conceptualize. The temperatures regularly fall to -30, -35 degrees Celsius at night. A cold so complete that exposed skin begins to develop frostbite within minutes, that metal becomes dangerously brittle, that the moisture in your breath freezes before it fully leaves your body. The landscape is a rolling, almost lunar terrain of snow-covered slopes, open ridges scoured by wind, and dense belts of Siberian fir and cedar in the lower elevations. In daylight, in clear weather, it has a stark, severe beauty, the kind of landscape that photographs magnificently and kills efficiently. At night, in a blizzard, it becomes something else entirely, an environment so hostile, so completely indifferent to human presence, that survival requires not just physical endurance, but an absolute mental composure, a refusal to panic, a capacity to think clearly in conditions where every instinct in the body is screaming to move, to run, to find warmth at any cost. These 9 people had been trained to operate in exactly this environment. They had done it before. They knew the Urals, they respected the Urals, and they had prepared accordingly. That preparation is what makes what ultimately happened to them so profoundly inexplicable. Their destination was a Torten mountain, a name that in the indigenous Mansi language translates roughly to "do not go there." Whether anyone noticed the irony at the time is not recorded. The route would take them through the northern Urals, across a landscape of dense forest and open snowfields, through temperatures that regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius at night. The trek was classified as a Category 3 expedition, the highest difficulty level recognised by Soviet hiking standards. It was ambitious, it was demanding, and it was exactly the kind of challenge these 9 people had trained for. They departed from Sverdlovsk by train on the 23rd of January 1959 and began their trek a few days later after arriving at a small settlement called Ivdel and then travelling onward by truck and on foot. Their plan was to reach a Torten mountain, document the journey and return by mid-February, in time for Igor Dyatlov to send a telegram confirming their safe return. The group kept a journal and took photographs. The recovered images show them laughing, resting, building snow shelters, moving through a landscape of extraordinary, brutal beauty. By all appearances, the early days of the expedition went according to plan. Cold, difficult, exhausting, but within expectations. On the 1st of February 1959, they made camp on the eastern slope of a mountain the Mansi people called Kolatsiakl, Dead Mountain. They were 1 day's journey from Otorten. They set up their tent, made preparations for the night, and then something happened. There is a category of historical mystery that operates differently from the others. Most unsolved cases feel like puzzles with missing pieces. You can see the shape of what is absent, you understand roughly what would fill the gap, and the frustration lies in simply not having the information available. But there is another category entirely. Cases where the pieces you do have do not fit together in any conventional framework. Cases where the evidence, examined honestly and without prejudice, refuses to resolve into a coherent picture no matter how you arrange it. Cases that do not feel like puzzles with missing pieces so much as puzzles, with pieces from 2 entirely different boxes. One box labelled ordinary human tragedy, and the other labelled something else. The Dyatlov Pass incident is the most extreme example of this second category that the 20th century produced. 9 people died. That much is certain. Everything else, the cause, the sequence, the precise nature of what happened in those final hours, and above all the question of what compelled 9 experienced, rational, and well-equipped human beings to abandon their shelter and walk barefoot into lethal cold, remains genuinely, stubbornly, and in some ways deliberately unresolved. Tonight, we are going to walk through everything we know, and then we are going to follow an investigator into everything we are not supposed to know. Stay with me. Compared to the physical evidence, but that Morozov finds deeply significant. In the days leading up to their last camp, several members of the group noted unusual atmospheric conditions. colours in the sky that did not correspond to the aurora borealis, which was familiar to experienced travellers in this latitude, but something more localised, more directional, more specific to a particular area of the horizon. Krivonishenko's personal diary, recovered from the campsite, contains a brief reference to what he called a glow over the ridge, written on the 31st of January, the day before the group made their final camp. He did not elaborate. The entry is short, almost casual, as though he noticed something worth mentioning but not worth dwelling on. That entry, Morozov argues, represents the first documented observation by a member of the Dyatlov group of the phenomenon that would ultimately claim their lives. A glow over the ridge, in that direction, on the night before everything changed. The search began on the 26th of February 1959, more than 3 weeks after the group should have returned. When rescuers finally reached the campsite on the slope of Kolatsyakel, what they found did not make sense. The tent was still standing. It had not been torn apart by wind or buried by an avalanche. It was there, upright, partially covered in snow, but it had been cut open from the inside. Long, deliberate slashes through the fabric made with a knife from within. The hikers' belongings were still inside, their food, their supplies, most critically their boots, their warm outer clothing, the items without which no rational person would willingly step out into -30-degree darkness. And yet they had. All 9 of them, barefoot or in socks, in thin inner garments, into a night cold enough to kill an unprepared person in minutes. Footprints in the snow led away from the tent, down the slope, toward a line of trees roughly 1.5 kilometers below. The prints indicated a calm, controlled walk, not a panicked sprint, not the chaotic stumbling of people seized by terror. A deliberate, steady movement away from the tent and toward the tree line. Whatever had compelled them to leave had not caused them to run. It had caused them to walk, purposefully, as though they were moving away from something specific, something they had located with their eyes, and were determined to put distance between themselves and that single detail. The controlled, measured pace of the footprints is one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case, because panic you can explain. Calm, directed flight into lethal cold without your shoes is something else entirely. The tent was cut from the inside. 9 people walked barefoot into -30 degrees, and the footprints were calm. The first 2 bodies were found near the tree line. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko were discovered at the base of a large Siberian cedar tree. They were barefoot. They were wearing only underwear. Around the tree there were broken branches at a height of several meters, evidence that someone had climbed the tree, perhaps to get a better view of something, or perhaps to escape something on the ground. A small fire had been lit nearby. It had burned briefly and gone out. Both men had died of hypothermia. Between the cedar and the tent, 3 more bodies were found. Igor Dyatlov himself, Zenaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. They had died attempting to return to the tent. Slobodin had a small fracture in his skull, though it was not considered by early investigators to be the cause of death. They were found at intervals along the slope, as though each had fallen and been unable to get back up. Dyatlov was found with his face toward the tent. He had been trying to get back. The remaining 4, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Zolotaryov, Nicholas Thibault-Brignolel, and Alexander Kolevatov, were not found until May, when the snow began to melt. They were discovered in a ravine, buried beneath 4 meters of compacted snow, near a small stream. And it was these 4 whose injuries would become the most studied, the most debated, and the most inexplicable element of the entire case. Thibault-Brignolel had a massive skull fracture, the kind of traumatic head injury that would typically result from an extreme physical impact. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had multiple broken ribs, not 1 or 2, but multiple ribs, on both sides of the body, shattered in a way that forensic experts would later compare to the injuries sustained in high-speed automobile accidents or from extreme pressure events. These were not injuries from a fall. They were not consistent with an avalanche, which had been one of the early theories. A forensic expert involved in the case stated at the time that the force required to produce such damage would have been enormous, and yet the skin showed no external trauma, no bruising matching the severity of the internal injuries, no lacerations, no evidence of a physical blow from the outside. The destruction was from within, or from a force that did not leave the marks that ordinary forces leave. And then there was Lyudmila Dubinina. Her tongue was missing, not accidentally bitten off, not removed by scavengers in any way consistent with the patterns found elsewhere on the body. Missing, along with her eyes, soft tissue gone. Investigators would later attribute this to decomposition and the action of running water from the stream. But the explanation has always sat uneasily with those who have reviewed the case in detail. The degree of soft tissue loss in the specific areas affected has never been satisfactorily explained by natural post-mortem processes alone. The full forensic picture of the 4 hikers found in the ravine has taken decades to be properly appreciated, in part because the original Soviet autopsy reports were classified, and in part because even when they were eventually made available, the translation and interpretation of Soviet-era forensic documentation required specialised knowledge that Western researchers initially lacked. What became clear, as the reports were analysed by an expanding community of investigators in the 2000s and 2010s, was that the injuries found on Dubinina, Zolotaryov and Thibaut Brignolel specifically represented a level of force that fell entirely outside the parameters of anything the terrain and weather could plausibly produce. A forensic expert consulted by one Russian documentary team estimated that the rib fractures found on Dubinina would require a compressive force equivalent to that exerted by a vehicle travelling at high speed. The ribs were not cracked. They were not fractured in the way that falls produce fractures, with 1 or 2 breaks along stress lines. They were shattered. Multiple fractures, bilateral, in a pattern that experienced trauma surgeons recognise from high-velocity impact events. And yet, the skin was intact. The tissue over the fractured ribs showed no bruising consistent with such an impact. No hematoma, no surface trauma. Whatever force had reached through Lyudmila Dubinina's body to break her ribs in that pattern had done so without leaving its mark on the outside of her. That is not a natural force. That is not a known natural force. That is something else. One other detail from the ravine bodies that Morozov returns to repeatedly is the state of their clothing. Some items had been cut, not torn, but cut with the precision of a blade, and redistributed. Pieces of clothing from one victim were found on another. This has been interpreted by some researchers as evidence that the surviving members of the group in their final hours had attempted to share warmth by redistributing available clothing among those most severely injured. It is a humanising interpretation, and it may be partially correct. But Morozov notes that the pattern of redistribution does not fully align with simple emergency care. Some of the cuts were too precise, some of the distribution patterns too methodical, as though the clothing had been assessed, evaluated and moved, not by 9 people in extremis, but by someone else, someone who arrived after the fact, someone who was looking for something. Several of the hikers' clothing tested positive for elevated levels of radioactive contamination, beta radiation. The Soviet investigation noted this finding and ultimately attributed it to the fact that some of the hikers had previously worked in environments where radioactive materials were present, specifically Krivonishenko, who had worked at a nuclear facility following the Kishtim disaster in 1957. But critics of this explanation point out that the distribution of radiation on the clothing does not align cleanly with simple contamination from prior occupational exposure. The readings were localized in ways that suggested something more recent, something encountered on the mountain. The file on the radiation findings, like so much of the Dyatlov case, was sealed, classified, unavailable to outside researchers for decades. Researchers who eventually gained access to the radiation data noted something particularly striking. The contamination was not distributed evenly across all items of clothing. It was concentrated on specific garments in specific locations, primarily on the lower legs and midsections of several victims. If the contamination had originated from previous occupational exposure, as the Soviet investigation claimed, it would be expected to appear across all items worn closest to the body, distributed in the relatively even pattern of long-term, low-level exposure. Instead, it was patchy, directional, as though something had irradiated the clothing from a specific angle, in a specific moment, leaving a pattern more consistent with acute short-duration exposure to a directional source than with the diffuse contamination of extended workplace contact. The dosimetry, examined by independent nuclear physicists in the 2000s, suggested levels that, while not immediately lethal, were significantly above background for the region and the conditions. Something at that location, on that night, had been emitting radiation, and the Soviet state had known that and had chosen to explain it away, with a story about a 3-year-old industrial accident 200 kilometers distant. The Soviet investigation concluded in May of 1959. The official verdict: the hikers had died as a result of a compelling unknown force, not a bear, not criminal violence, not an avalanche, not exposure in the conventional sense, an unknown compelling force. It is one of the most extraordinary phrases ever written as a legal conclusion. It is not a finding, it is an admission, and the case was closed with it, as though the very vagueness of the explanation was itself the point, as though someone, somewhere, needed the answer to remain unclear. The lead investigator, a man named Lev Ivanov, spent decades after the case unable to speak publicly about it. When he finally did give an interview, in the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he said something that has haunted researchers ever since. He said that he had been ordered, not asked, ordered, to close the case and classify the most sensitive findings. He said that he believed, based on everything he had seen and collected during the investigation, that some kind of extraordinary phenomenon had been involved. A phenomenon that he could not name, not because he lacked a theory, but because he had been explicitly told that naming it was not something he was permitted to do. He died in 2003 without having ever fully explained what he believed had happened to the 9 hikers of the Dyatlov expedition. His silence, maintained for over 40 years, is itself a kind of testimony. Decades passed. The Soviet Union collapsed. Files were opened, some of them, and a new generation of researchers began sifting through what had been left behind. Among them, in our narrative, is a man we will call Alexei Morozov, a composite of the actual researchers, historians, and investigative journalists who have spent years working the Dyatlov case, cross-referencing the physical evidence with newly available Cold War-era documentation. Morozov is not a conspiracy theorist in the dismissive sense of the word. He's a man who believes in following evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere that makes you profoundly uncomfortable. Morozov's methodology is important to understand because it is what separates his work from the vast body of speculation that the Dyatlov case has generated over the decades. He does not begin with a conclusion and search for supporting evidence. He begins with anomalies, with the specific details in the record that refuse to be explained by any conventional framework, and he follows those anomalies methodically, cross-referencing each one against available primary sources. He is, by training, an archivist. He spent years working with declassified Soviet military and intelligence documents at a research institute in Moscow, and he developed during that work an acute sensitivity to a particular kind of bureaucratic signal, the document that says almost nothing, precisely because it is hiding almost everything. The Soviet administrative system was extraordinarily elaborate in its mechanisms for information concealment. Not everything was simply stamped classified and locked away. Some of the most sensitive information was managed through a more sophisticated technique, the creation of documents that appeared innocuous, that were filed in apparently mundane categories, that referenced real programs and real locations, but that used language so carefully chosen as to render their actual content invisible to anyone who did not already know what they were looking at. Morozov spent years learning to read that language, and when he turned that skill to the Dyatlov case, what he found in the administrative record of the Northern Urals region in the late 1950s was not a blank. It was a very specific, very carefully constructed kind of silence. His starting point is the maps. Soviet military maps from the late 1950s, some of which were declassified, some of which were obtained through researchers with access to former military archives, reveal something that had never been publicly discussed in the context of the Dyatlov case. In the region of the Northern Urals, in the general area of Kholat-Syakhl, there are designations on internal Soviet military maps that do not appear on any publicly available cartography from the period. Restricted areas. Not unusual in the Soviet context, the USSR maintained vast classified zones throughout its territory, for everything from nuclear testing to military exercises to simple administrative control over indigenous territories. But the specific zone in question, according to Morozov's reconstruction, extended further than any publicly acknowledged reason would require. The nearest known military installation was not close enough to justify the radius of the restricted area, and the restrictions were not documented in any standard military registry. They existed, but they had no official parent, no named facility, no listed purpose, just a boundary on a map that was never meant to be seen. This is where Morozov's investigation takes a turn that requires a willingness to hold two things simultaneously: rigorous skepticism and an open mind. Because the next layer of documentation he uncovers does not come from military maps. It comes from witness statements, collected during the original investigation, filed, and then buried in the classified portion of the case file for over 30 years. In the weeks around the Dyatlov incident, multiple witnesses in the broader region of the northern Urals reported seeing unusual aerial phenomena. These were not fringe individuals making sensational claims. They were meteorologists, military personnel stationed at weather observation outposts, a geologist on a separate field expedition. All of them described roughly the same thing: glowing spheres or orbs, orange or pale amber in colour, moving silently across the night sky, moving in patterns that did not correspond to aircraft of the period. No sound, no contrail, directional changes that no jet or rocket of 1959 could execute. The sightings clustered around the nights of late January and early February, the same window in which the Dyatlov group was on the mountain. Some of these witness statements were included in the original investigation file. They were then reclassified and removed from the public version of the record. Why? If the official explanation was an environmental event, wind, avalanche, panic, why would unrelated aerial sightings from civilians and military observers require suppression? Morozov's answer is that they were not unrelated, and that the suppression was not incidental. It was integral to a much larger project of concealment, one that had been ongoing since at least the mid-1950s, and that involved not just the military, but the highest levels of the Soviet scientific establishment. To understand what Morozov believes was happening in that restricted zone, you have to go back to the early years of the Cold War arms race, and to a set of events that have been extensively documented in declassified American intelligence reports, if not in Soviet ones. By the early 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were aware that something unusual was operating in their airspace. Not enemy aircraft, not weather balloons, something else. The United States response was Project Blue Book, an officially sanctioned Air Force investigation that ultimately classified the vast majority of its significant findings. The Soviet response was quieter, less documented, and according to Morozov's research, considerably more consequential. The Soviet program, as Morozov reconstructs it from fragments of declassified documentation, internal memos obtained through post-Soviet archival research, and testimony from former Soviet scientists who spoke to researchers in the 1990s, was not merely an observation program, it was an interaction program. The Soviets, by Morozov's account, had not simply detected anomalous aerial phenomena. They had established a form of contact, limited, controlled, deeply secretive, and conducted at a specific location, a research installation in the remote northern Urals, deliberately chosen for its isolation, its distance from populated centres, and its position beneath a particular corridor of airspace that had shown repeated anomalous activity since the early 1950s. The nature of this contact, as Morozov theorises it, was transactional, not a science fiction scenario of ambassadors and declarations, something far more clinical and dangerous. The programme's operators had acquired, through means that Morozov is careful not to speculate beyond available evidence, certain technologies of non-human origin, materials, design concepts, principles of propulsion and energy generation that were beyond the Soviet Union's own engineering capacity, but that could, if properly reverse-engineered, provide an extraordinary strategic advantage in the arms race. The testing of these technologies, their energetic properties, their atmospheric effects, their physical interaction with biological matter, required isolation, required a location where anomalous readings, unusual atmospheric phenomena, and the presence of non-standard equipment would not attract attention. The northern Urals, designated as restricted on internal military maps, monitored but officially undocumented, provided exactly that environment. The installation, as Morozov envisions it, was not a conventional military base. It had no barracks in the usual sense, no public-facing command structure, no supply chain that appeared in standard military logistics records. It was a black site, a facility that existed in the administrative gaps of the Soviet system, funded through channels that did not connect visibly to any recognized program. The personnel stationed there were not regular military. They were a mixture of scientific specialists, security operatives, and technical analysts, people with specific clearances that placed them outside the normal chain of command. People who did not officially exist at that location. People who, if the installation was ever discovered, could be disavowed completely. Morozov estimates, based on the administrative footprint he's been able to reconstruct, that the installation had been operational for at least 3 years before the Dyatlov incident. 3 years of testing, 3 years of refinement, 3 years of gradually expanding the operational envelope of technologies whose physical parameters were still being understood. In that time, the installation had developed its own internal protocols for exactly the kind of situation it would face in February of 1959, the unintended approach of unauthorized personnel. The protocols, as Morozov reads them from fragmentary references in the administrative record, were not designed to be gentle. The installation's mandate required absolute security, absolute silence. And the security personnel assigned to enforce that mandate had been given, in the deliberately vague language of Soviet-era operational directives, the authority to take whatever measures were necessary to preserve the integrity of the site. Whatever measures were necessary. 4 words, the most dangerous phrase in the vocabulary of any covert program. On the night of the 1st of February 1959, the Dyatlov group made camp on the slope of Kholat Shakhl. They were, by Morozov's calculation, within several kilometres of the outer perimeter of the restricted zone. Not inside it, not yet, but close enough that their presence had been detected. The installation's perimeter, monitoring systems, the specific nature of which Morozov leaves deliberately uncertain, noting only that they were consistent with technologies being tested at the site, had registered the group's approach. Security personnel at the installation were alerted. What happened next in Morozov's reconstruction unfolded in stages. First, the hikers saw something, an object above the mountain, luminous, silent, large enough to be unmistakable against the night sky. Not a star, not a meteorological phenomenon, something structured, something that moved with intention, something that hovered and then shifted with a speed and precision that no aircraft of the era could replicate. The group was experienced enough to know what they were not looking at, and frightened enough by what they were looking at to make a decision that, in retrospect, is the only decision that fully explains the physical evidence. They cut their tent open from the inside and they ran, not in panic, in controlled, deliberate flight, because whoever was in that tent understood, with immediate and terrible clarity, that whatever was above them was not something they should remain beneath. Morozov reconstructs the precise sequence inside the tent, based on the physical evidence. The cuts in the fabric were made at roughly torso height, the height at which a kneeling or crouching person would naturally wield a knife. Multiple cuts, from at least 2 different points along the tent wall, suggesting that more than one person was cutting simultaneously. The cuts were made with urgency, but not hysteria. They are straight enough to indicate directed intention, but overlapping in a way that suggests haste. The group was not calmly planning their exit. They were executing it as quickly as possible, and the distribution of exits, cuts on one side of the tent, with the group emerging and then moving together, suggests that whatever they saw was on a specific side. They cut away from it. They emerged on the side of the tent facing downhill, and then they walked. Together, in a line, moving away from the thing above them and toward the only cover available, the trees below. They moved toward the tree line. They put themselves under cover. They built a fire, small, survivable, not a signal fire, but a warmth fire, the fire of people who intend to wait out a situation and then move when it is safe. And then the situation changed. The security personnel from the installation, Morozov theorizes, reached the group's position within a period of time consistent with the forensic timeline. What followed is the part of his reconstruction that is the most carefully argued and the most disturbing, because the injuries on the bodies, specifically the catastrophic internal trauma found on the 4 hikers discovered in the ravine, are not consistent with a physical beating, an explosion, an avalanche, or any known natural force. They are, however, consistent with something that Morozov found referenced in fragments of Soviet technical documentation from the late 1950s, directed pressure technology. Experimental systems designed to incapacitate or eliminate targets through the application of focused pressure waves, concentrated, directional, and capable of producing massive internal injury while leaving the outer surface of the body largely intact. Exactly the injury profile found on Dubinina, Zolotaryov, Thibaut Brignolel, and Kolovatov. The technology, if it existed, and if it was deployed that night, would also explain several other anomalies. The controlled nature of the flight from the tent. The hikers were not running from something random. They were moving with purpose, and at some point they were herded perhaps toward the ravine. The distribution of the bodies, some closer to the tent, some at the tree line, some in the ravine, reflects not a single catastrophic event, but a sequence of events over the course of several hours, and the radiation on the clothing, directed energy systems, particularly experimental ones being tested in the 1950s, could plausibly have left radioactive traces on materials in proximity to the discharge point. Not the kind of contamination from a nuclear weapon, the kind of contamination from a technology that was itself radioactive adjacent, something being developed at the bleeding edge of what was then theoretically possible. Morozov is careful to acknowledge what he does not know. He does not know the exact nature of the installation. He does not know the precise sequence of events that night. He does not know whether the deaths were ordered from above, were the decision of the security personnel on the ground, or were the accidental consequence of a technology whose effects were not fully understood, even by those deploying it. What he does know, what the evidence, in his interpretation compels, is that the 9 hikers of the Dyatlov expedition did not die of hypothermia and bad weather. They died because they were in the wrong place, and because the wrong place was something that could not be allowed to become known. The cover-up in Morozov's analysis was not improvised. It was executed with the precision and institutional depth of a system that had been covering up sensitive operations for decades. The bodies were recovered, the scene was assessed, the decision was made, at what level of the Soviet hierarchy Morozov cannot determine with certainty, that the investigation would be controlled, limited, and ultimately closed with an explanation that explained nothing. The forensic reports that documented the most anomalous injuries were classified. The witness statements about aerial phenomena were removed from the public file. The radiation findings were given a cover explanation that was plausible enough to be accepted without being specific enough to be verified, and the case was handed to a regional prosecutor who was given just enough information to conduct a plausible investigation and told just enough to know that he should not look too closely. The phrase, unknown compelling force, was not an admission of defeat. It was a construction, a deliberate linguistic choice that satisfied the legal requirement of a conclusion, while ensuring that no specific claim was made that could later be disproved or built upon. An unknown compelling force cannot be investigated further, because its nature is explicitly unspecified. It cannot be challenged, because it contains no falsifiable proposition. It is the perfect official explanation for something that must never be officially explained. And it worked for decades. The case was closed, the files were sealed, the mountain was left to its snow and its silence, and the 9 names were gradually absorbed into the cold mythology of Soviet tragedy, filed alongside the famines and the purges and the disappeared, where the dead are numerous enough that the details of any single story can be allowed to blur. But the details did not stay blurred, because the human need to understand, to place events within a framework of cause and effect, to refuse the comfort of deliberate vagueness, is stronger than any government's ability to enforce silence indefinitely. Researchers began working the case in the 1980s and 90s as Soviet archives began to open. Journalists, former investigators, family members of the dead who had never accepted the official account. They found the witness statements, they found the radiation data, they found the inconsistencies in the forensic record, and they found, buried in the declassified fragments of Cold War-era Soviet technical programs, tantalizing references to projects that had no publicly acknowledged home. Programs described only in the most oblique terms, their purpose unclear, their location unspecified, their budget invisible in the public record. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the Dyatlov case, officially. The new investigation was widely publicized and ultimately concluded, in 2020, that an avalanche was responsible for the deaths. Investigators used sophisticated snow modelling to argue that a slab avalanche of an unusual type could have produced the internal injuries found on the 4 hikers in the ravine and could have triggered the group's flight from the tent. It was a more scientifically grounded explanation than anything offered in 1959, and it was immediately challenged by avalanche experts, forensic specialists, and the surviving family members of the dead, who pointed out that the slope angle of Kholat-Syakhl is below the threshold at which slab avalanches typically initiate, that no avalanche debris was found at the scene by the original investigators, and that an avalanche does not explain the radiation, the aerial, sightings, or the sealed files. The Russian government's reopened investigation had the appearance of resolution and the substance of the original, a conclusion that answered some questions by declining to address others. Morozov, in the final phase of his investigation, turns to a question that extends beyond the specific facts of the Dyatlov case. He asks, if the Soviet program existed, if there was a research installation in the northern Urals conducting experiments with recovered non-human technology, what happened to it? Did it end with the death of 9 hikers and the sealing of a case file? Or did it continue? And if it continued, where did it go? The answers he finds are not conclusive. They are suggestive. They are the kind of answers that do not resolve a question so much as deepen it. Because the pattern he identifies in Soviet Cold War-era technical programs, the sudden acceleration in certain propulsion research in the early 1960s, the classified energy generation experiments that never produced publicly documented results, but that consumed enormous resources, the atmospheric monitoring stations in the northern Urals that remained active long after any conventional meteorological purpose would have required, all of these point to a program that did not end, a program that evolved, that moved, that may have been transferred, in the years following the Soviet collapse, into different hands, different institutions, different countries, along with so much else that emerged from the wreckage of the USSR's classified history. The technology that Morozov believes was tested on the slopes of Kholat-Syakhl, if it existed, if it was real, did not die with the 9 hikers. It was not buried with them, and in the decades since, the global conversation about unidentified aerial phenomena has shifted in ways that, to Morozov's eye, look less like a gradual awakening to new information and more like the slow, controlled release of something that was always known: the American government's acknowledgement of UAP encounters by military pilots, the establishment of formal congressional oversight of UAP programs, the testimony of former intelligence officials before the United States Senate. These are not the actions of governments discovering something new. They are the actions of governments deciding, for reasons of their own, what to reveal and when. What is particularly striking in Morozov's analysis is the timing. The modern wave of official UAP acknowledgement began in earnest in 2017, with the publication of footage from United States Navy encounters with unidentified aerial objects, footage that the Department of Defense had been aware of for years and had actively sought to suppress before a partial leak forced a more public response. In the years that followed, the pace of disclosure accelerated. Congressional hearings, Inspector General reports, the formation of dedicated oversight bodies, and, most dramatically, sworn testimony from credible former government officials claiming direct knowledge of recovery programs involving non-human technology. Whether these claims are accurate is, as with everything in this space, genuinely uncertain. But Morozov finds the trajectory compelling and worrying, because the pattern of disclosure, selective, managed, incremental, is precisely the pattern you would expect from a program that is not opening up out of transparency, but is controlling a narrative, releasing enough to establish a framework, shaping what the public understands before the public has the chance to understand something different. And in that framing, the Dyatlov incident occupies a specific and significant place, because it is, in Morozov's view, one of the earliest documented cases in which the intersection of human observers, non-human aerial technology, and state concealment produced a measurable physical outcome. 9 people died. Their deaths were covered up. The cover-up was maintained for decades, and the technology, whatever it was, whatever it did on that mountain in February of 1959, continued to be developed, continued to be tested, and continued to be hidden behind the same impenetrable wall of official indifference and classified documentation that has characterized every serious encounter between human governments and this phenomenon, regardless of which government, regardless of which decade, regardless of which country's territory the encounter occurred on. The mountain changes. The program does not. There is a detail about the Dyatlov case that Morozov returns to repeatedly in his analysis, because he finds it the most compelling of all the anomalies, and the one most resistant to any conventional explanation. It is not the injuries, it is not the radiation, it is not the aerial sightings, or the sealed files, or the phrase unknown compelling force. It is the footprints. The measured steady footprints in the snow, leading away from the tent in the controlled purposeful stride of 9 people who were very frightened but were not panicking. 9 people who had decided collectively and in the span of minutes to abandon their shelter and their equipment and their boots and to walk, not run, into a killing cold. 9 experienced, trained, rational human beings who made the most irrational decision of their lives with perfect composure, because whatever they saw above them was so far outside the boundaries of their understanding, so completely beyond the framework of anything they had been prepared to encounter in a lifetime of scientific education and mountaineering experience, that rational behaviour became impossible, not through fear, through comprehension, because they understood, in that moment, that the rules of the world they knew had been suspended, and that the only response available to them was to put as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever had suspended those rules. They walked, calmly, into the dark, into the cold, into whatever came next. And whatever came next was something that the Soviet government spent the following decades making absolutely certain no one would ever clearly see. Dead Mountain still stands, Kholat-Syakhl in the indigenous Mansi language, a name that was old before the Soviet Union existed, old before the Cold War, old before any of the geopolitical forces that shaped the 1950s had taken form. The Mansi people of the northern Urals had their own reasons for avoiding the mountain. Their oral traditions do not elaborate extensively on what those reasons were, but the name they gave it was not a description of the landscape, it was a warning. And warnings, in old cultures, are not given without cause. They are given because something happened, something that was important enough to encode in the name of a place so that every generation that came after would know, do not go there. Igor Dyatlov and his 8 companions did not know the warning, or perhaps they did, and trusted their training to carry them past it. Either way, they went. They crossed whatever line exists on that slope, a line on a Soviet military map, a line in the landscape of something older and stranger than Cold War politics, or perhaps both. Perhaps a line that was always there, and that the Soviets simply found and claimed and put their own fences around. They crossed it on the night of February 1st, 1959, and the mountain, or whatever the mountain contains, did what it has apparently always done to those who crossed that line. It made sure they could not come back and describe what they had seen. The details that remain, the footprints, the tent, the broken ribs, the missing tongue, the orange spheres in the sky, the sealed files, the radiation are not answers. They are the residue of an event that was designed to leave no clear answers, a controlled ambiguity, a story that could be examined endlessly and still yield nothing conclusive, because the people who could have made it conclusive made sure it would not be. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling conclusion of all. Not that something extraordinary happened on that mountain in 1959, but that someone knew it had happened and made a deliberate, methodical, successful effort to ensure that the world would never be entirely certain what it was. The not knowing is not an accident. It is the result. Confusion, sustained across decades, is a form of control. A story that cannot be resolved is a story that cannot be acted upon, and so the 9 remain exactly where the Soviet state placed them, in the gap between the known and the unknowable. Not forgotten. The case is too strange, too persistent, too richly anomalous to be forgotten, but not resolved either. Never resolved. That is the warning zone, not a place on a map, a condition, a state of deliberate enforced uncertainty, maintained by those who know the answer and have chosen, for reasons of their own, to keep it locked inside the same frozen silence that claimed 9 young lives in the winter of 1959. Somewhere above the tree line on Dead Mountain, the wind moves across the snow the same way it always has. Patient, indifferent, keeping its secrets the way cold keeps everything, perfectly, indefinitely, without effort or intention. Just preservation, just silence, just the mountain, and whatever the mountain knows, and the long unbroken dark of a Russian winter that gives nothing back.